Welcome to the first episode of the Tucana People Analytics podcast. I'm Max Blumberg from Goldsmiths University of London and founder of the Blumberg Partnership. We'll be presenting weekly conversations with leading professionals and thought leaders in the people analytics space on a variety of topics around data-driven HR, workforce planning, and employee insight. This week, I'm speaking with Peter Wilde, former Global Head of Employee Research and Insight at Unilever and UBS, and now leading his consultancy, Employee Research, working for huge clients the world over. We're talking about employee insight in the age of digital HR, its quantification and impact on employee engagement and productivity. We'll find out what sort of data should we be looking at, what are the best practices for this, and how do you know what's right for your organization? We're going to look at how the term engagement is being redefined today and how you can frame it to generate better insights that advise your business strategy and increase business performance. Stay tuned for a fascinating conversation with someone who has worked at the very top of this field for many years and who has a real passion for data and how it can make a difference to people's happiness and productivity. Peter, you've got a very illustrious past, if that's the right word, in this whole field of engagement. How did you get into it? What sort of companies have you worked with?
Yeah, so it's something I actually did straight out of university. I was very fortunate to work at Ipsos Mori as a very young man, a long time ago. And they allowed you to specialise in an area of research which was of interest to you. So, you could do political research or sports research or anything. And I just found the subject of engagement and employee research absolutely fascinating. I think I saw early on that it was one of those rare careers where what you do is good for a business and also good for people, so good for the wider set of kind of humanity, if you will. So there was for me, there was a relatively altruistic element to it, and I've just done that ever since.
That's very exciting to me, especially wearing, a commercial hat on the one hand and a people hat on the other hand. How easy is it to balance the needs of the organization and the employee? Is it a doable task where both can be happy, or is it a sort of a compromise at best where neither party ends up happy?
The glass half full. I think it is possible. It's a tricky one to do. I think if you have a strategic, progressive, intelligent HR function that you're working with, then it can work for all. I'm always conscious that it needs to have a return on investment and to affect the bottom line. But on the flip side, part of me internally always thinks I'm going to kind of stand up for the workers, and it's a really nice thing to be able to do. To go into an organisation, stand in front of a board and saying, here's what your people genuinely think, and this is what you're doing wrong. and they do tend to listen when you phrase it like that.
And I understand that, and why do you think engagement is so important in organizations? Is it a rising topic? Is it something that most organizations understand? Why do we hear so much about it?
Yeah, I mean, the concept of engagement isn't new. Where can you draw it back? When did it start? Tricky one. I think there's a degree to which it's always been there in the military. I think there is a degree to which, from a business perspective, it was improved, raised and noted especially in the manufacturing industry, Japanese models of worker engagement, although it wasn't called engagement. And then fast forward, I guess, into the 50s, 60s and 70s and 80s with this kind of employee satisfaction models, and then obviously being coined in the 90s onwards as engagement. Is it a new thing? No. Is it an important thing? Yes. I don't know about you, but even from my own personal experience, I've worked in organisations where the workforce is engaged, and it's very different when you work in a workforce where it's not engaged. Does it have an effect on the bottom line? Absolutely. There's enough evidence out there. There's almost too much evidence out there to that effect. And I've never seen a counter argument to its effectiveness that I've agreed with.
So what does your work in engagement involve? What kind of things do you do for companies?
only a part of what we do is specifically around engagement. I do sometimes feel that organisations feel it's something they have to do or have to be seen to be doing. Therefore, how do we do it? And so normally when I approach clients and we do projects, there is an element to which, quote unquote, engagement is measured. I don't know necessarily how important for each organisation it actually is, whether it can be seen as an antecedent, whether it can be seen as an outcome, whether it's something tangible enough to be measured. I'm not necessarily the greatest exponent of that.
So what do you think it takes to engage a company in engagement, if you'll pardon the expression?
To engage, to get them interested in the concept of engagement.
Yeah. How do you? I mean, when you're approaching a company that typically, doesn't hold its staff in the high esteem that perhaps it should be, what does one need to say to organizations to get them more interested in it?
To get them more interested in engagement isn't something that I'd necessarily actively do. Ironically, I think people tend to approach agencies and say, we've got a problem with engagement. We want to do something about engagement. Can you please do it? I'd take the opposite tack and say, what do you really need to find out about your workforce? What's actually going to be useful rather than a relatively generic measurement? And people seem to take that on board. I think the notion of a bespoke research project, which actually works for that organisation, will always be more powerful than saying, the global engagement score is 52 and you're a 53, so please go away, everything's fine. I think especially with tech, and especially over the last few years, we can be a lot smarter than that.
So your work revolves primarily around research and engagement. What are the kinds of things that you research then?
So, I mean, it might be, as I say, going above and beyond just saying finding a company's engagement scores. It could be issues around performance management, about talent, about recruitment and leadership, culture of the organisation, and stuff that's a bit more pragmatic and tangible, I think. If as an organisation you want to find out why fewer women are going to senior management roles, there are ways of finding that out with research that don't necessarily involve asking for generic employee engagement questions.
So for you, the whole area is much broader than engagement. It's the whole talent management and performance piece, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, being bespoke means that I can push back to organisations and say, we could ask everyone about engagement, but you're actually trying to find out about something different. So why don't we try and find out about that? And that seems to go down quite well. I have worked for both agency and client side, and I've too often seen a big consultancy just come in and say, right, here's the questions that you need to ask, and they'll give you the answers that they want without actually listening to the client. That was always a massive frustration of mine working at big companies.
So what are the major issues that you think yourself and indeed your clients face when it comes to the whole area of engagement and talent management?
I would say that having any form of strategic plan to address low engagement is problematic, which is why I don't feel that any research agency or any company should just stop at the point at which you say your engagement score is X. It's absolutely being able to guide people through improving their engagement levels. And that really means assisting with all of the talent management strategy. So it's much wider than just the concept of engagement.
What do you think holds companies back from developing a basic strategy to manage their engagement then?
I think it's not necessarily a lack of will. It's more around, I'd say, a lack of time. So people have finite resources. The person who's responsible, quote unquote, which I despise, saying someone's responsible for engagement, one person, they've got 147 other things to do, some of which have deadlines, many of which are perhaps more practical, tangible outcomes. And this might just be a tick box element of their role. And often you see that there just isn't the desire to work on it internally. I sound very negative here. I must just say that the flip side of this is that, as I say, when you get a strategic, passionate, clued up team who get it, who have the tools to get it, and then push stuff out through the organisation, it can be absolutely brilliant. If you've got a compelling narrative that the senior management is bought into, it can work really, really well.
And I guess that's the question that I was trying to come to earlier, that, managers do have so many business and operational issues facing them. HR, naturally, it's part of their core work. So how do you get the line of business to make it a higher priority so that they do create this all-important strategy that you say organizations need, and which I heartily agree with you?
I think you're right. Absolutely, you need a wider strategy. You need to be able to go in and say to the organization, this stuff is important because specifically if you're an organization, people are going to leave. They're telling us they're going to leave unless you do X, Y, Z, or whatever it might be. And as you say, that's what I'm talking about in terms of making it wider around more of the whole talent management piece, rather than just a job satisfaction score. I think you're able to do that much more easily now with tying in large data sets, and with if you're given access to other HR metrics and data, and you can intelligently tie that together with perception data, which is what we're talking about. You can affect real change. I'll give you an example. The most recent large quote unquote engagement survey that I did for an organisation highlighted a real series of problems with middle management in about 3/4 of the organisation, and there were some specific issues about those managers which were causing real discontent. So we worked with the leadership team and with the HR team to identify what those. And there are only simple things that needed to change around, I can't go into too much detail, but around contact and culture. And as a consequence of that, each manager had to sign up to what we called a management charter. Yeah. Literally put their name to the bottom of, I will do this and I will do this and I will do this. And they're held accountable for that. And that was something that had never happened in that organisation before. People just got promoted because they'd been there a long time. Whereas now they were, semi-publicly held up to account for a certain set of behaviours that the people wanted. Yes. And that's an example of what I mean by a win-win. It's good for the business, people stick around. It's good for Joe employee because they stick around as well.
So let's go back to something you said, I think really interesting, the use of data and intelligence. What is the role of data and intelligence, and how can one use it to improve the value of your workforce?
That's a big question.
It's a big question. It's a big question.
I think probably two ways. The first is the increased ability for a savvy organisation to retain and maintain good people metrics, and to be able to mix that with perception metrics and have really good scorecards. So that's something that's always been something that people have wanted to do, or it's often been too hard to do. But I think improvements in tech, and I don't want to use the phrase big data, so I'm not going to, but improvements in tech just allow those connections to be made, so we can look at gender bias in performance management and how that affects perceptions and how that affects attrition rates and stuff like that in a way that previously we haven't been able to. So that's one way. I think the second way that tech has changed, particularly what I do, is around qualitative data, allowing us to do analysis in a way that we weren't able to do before.
So tell us a bit more about that. We were chatting about the role of text analysis. What is emerging in text analysis that organizations should be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about this, Max, over the last few days, knowing we would have this conversation. Yeah. And obviously, I absolutely read your work in the field, so I'm not going to try and talk to you too much about the technical side of it. I can just talk a little bit about my side as a consultant, as having done this for a long time.
Since day one.
Since the 90s. Frankly, for market researchers, text analysis used to be a pain. Yeah. I remember sitting in the basements of big agencies with handwritten theming and coding jobs to do, which would take days. You'd have a team of junior analysts, and they'd get in pizza and then lock you in a room until you'd themed 1,000 comments. Yes. And that kind of manual coding is just so bad on so many levels. It's it's open to human error. Even if you back translate it, it's open to bias. If you get 3 people coding the same thing, they don't code things the same. Themes are have a degree to which they're defined by the person or the individual. There's nothing there's nothing easy, good, clean, or smart about the way that it used to be done. And I would always try to push the tech houses that I was working with to come up with a solution. So if you look at the kind of thing Snap used to do in the late 90s, moving from paper to online text analysis wasn't great.
Yes.
If you look at, well, I'm not going to name names, but sitting on the other side, sitting on the client side, working when I used to head up engagement for UBS or for Unilever, you'd get a beauty parade of organizations coming in saying, oh, we've got the greatest new tool that would do this. And the reality was that the tools didn't work. I found sentiment analysis to be a can of worms. The outputs were either wrong or too technologically blinding to be of any use as a consultant internally. Senior management never got it. And frankly, the whole thing just wasn't good enough. I don't know if this ties in with your experience as well.
I think it does. I think that academia has for a long time done, they call it qualitative analysis, and there's grounded theory and a whole bunch of different ways of approaching it. But it is a tough area because, as you say, it's very difficult to define what are the things that we should be looking for and how I define the underlying constructs. If I see employees as positive, I'm going to ask one set of questions or analyze it in one way. And if I don't see employees as valuable, I'm going to word my questions in another way. You mentioned Andrew Marrett, and I know Andrew Marrett does great work in this whole area of text mining. Do you guys work together in any kind of way yet?
Yeah, I've known Andrew for a decade, and we work together all the time. He's my go-to guy for the text analysis work. He, I think, is one of a small band of people globally who are now taking this stuff to the extra level. From the consultancy perspective, being sold stuff in the past, I've never been satisfied with it, and that's the golden test, isn't it, of whether or not this stuff works. That's the way you want to strip it out. And I think what we're seeing from Andrew definitely, and from another couple of players, I know that Twitter, who unfortunately couldn't join the call today, are doing something relatively similar, are really using the most modern technology to automate things to a degree which hasn't done before. So we're working together on a huge project, a pulse survey project, which each month automatically codes and themes and seeds tens of thousands of comments, and does it in a way in which we're able to give it to the client and for them to be satisfied in a way that I never was before.
That's fascinating. Tell us a bit more about pulse surveys, because it's a word we're hearing a lot more of. Is it a fad? Is it something that's going to stay with us? Is it going to replace the old climate or engagement survey? Well, what is the role of pulse surveys? How are they different?
Yeah, so this is the whole brave new world. I mean, obviously, as we say, new technology has enabled us to get feedback from employees much more often than we used to be able to. The classic notion of sending out a census survey to an entire population every 2 years, spending 6 months analysing it, and then the next 6 months talking about it. Those days have gone, largely. And certainly in the Western working world, people are used to, in their everyday interactions with technology, they're used to instantaneous feedback, instantaneous reporting, and whether it's Twitter or whether it's TripAdvisor or whether it's giving reviews on review sites, whatever. The notion of giving a once every 2 years or once a year set of feedback seems antiquated. That said, the flip side of asking employees for generic feedback on a very regular basis is just as disingenuous and almost not dangerous, but it doesn't work either. I mean, just because something can be done doesn't mean that it should be done. And the answer, I think, for each organisation lies in between those two extremes, a kind of sweet spot of getting quality, usable, insightful opinion data from your people. And I think it's different for every organisation. I don't go into organisations and say, yes, you should do a once-a-year survey, or yes, you should ask people what they think every week or whatever. The tech enables anything to be possible, but it's about the organisation, their aims, and also their culture. I think that for some organisations, it's still going to be the case that an annual survey is the best thing that they can do. When sometimes a large organisation to make practical or cultural changes, it's like turning an oil tanker around. And some organisations need a longer period of time to attempt to affect any change, and that's what we're all about. After all, that's the whole point of this, is to affect positive change.
So I think I heard you saying this. Sorry, just to ask a quick clarification. I think I heard you saying that pulse surveys are more actionable then?
I actually think they're probably less actionable. If you're trying to make a lot of changes or wholesale changes, or you're working within an organisation which is large and slow, if it's the NHS or if it's a big public sector organisation, there's no point asking for feedback probably on any more of a regular basis than once a year. I remember I used to do a internal poll for it's for the BBC actually, where they had a monthly poll on job satisfaction, and each month the results would come out, and because of course the nature of polling, it would be down 3%, and there'd be a panic internally. Oh no, what are we going to do? And then the next month it would be up 8%. And so there is a sweet spot, I think. And if the organisation, I'm doing some work for the NHS, they're not going to immediately affect any form of cultural or practical change within the 3 weeks that they've got before the next monthly poll comes out, kind of thing. So that's not suitable for them. For smaller, more agile organisations, then absolutely more regular feedback works brilliantly. And especially if you're asking about specific topics, we mustn't forget that there's often a fall off in response rate if you're asking the same questions month on month or week on week.
I think one of the greatest, I thought it was a great idea. I wonder what you think about it. United Utilities a couple of years ago did a quarterly engagement survey, but they gave it to different employees every quarter. So you weren't hit by a lot of survey fatigue having to answer it, but they got a good measure of the pulse. Do you think that that's a useful approach, staggering it across employees across the year?
I think that can work. I don't necessarily see any downsides in that, aside from the fact that you will need a one or two or possibly more full-time internal staff to deal with the fallout from that. Each one of these is a big exercise, and some organisations have 10 people internally working for a colleague engagement team. So for those people, that works brilliantly. I know some big organisations like Philips have a quarterly survey, and if that works for them, then that's fine. That's what I mean about it being bespoke to an organisation, both from the practical of running it level and also the action taking level. And so it's going to differ completely from company to company.
Well, will automation help to lessen the load required to process all of that pulse or engagement data?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do, as I say, we do a huge monthly poll where automation is the only way that we would ever be able to do that, both on the quant and the qual side. So having working with Andrew, having a methodology for automatically theming thousands of comments in a meaningful way, in a sensible way, is the only thing that's allowed us to do a job of that scale each month.
So something that fascinates me, just related to actioning what one finds. Why is it my perception, and I think I can say this from my own work with a number of organizations, that they seem to spend a fortune on engagement surveys, but yet that data often ends up in somebody's top drawer. Why do they bother to spend so much and then not do anything with it?
Max, that's something that I recognise absolutely, and I've seen example after example of it happening. I can assure you that there are lots of us employee research specialists who get together from time to time, drink too much beer, and bemoan the state of our clients' actions or lack thereof. absolutely, I agree. It's something that sometimes, however good or compelling the work that you do for an organisation is, the reality is that other things pop up, events, dear boy, and prevent people from effecting the change that you've advocated. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, ironically, sometimes this is seen as a bit of a tick box exercise, something that they have to do. There was a requirement brought into law, which stated that organisations above a certain size have to get feedback from their people, and some organisations just do that. The amount of cost and spend is something that previously has been huge and has shocked even me. And often organisations don't leverage what they get in any meaningful way, and that's disappointing for everyone. I would say that if you're not going to do anything, don't bother doing it at all. It's actually a negative drag on employees.
I strongly agree with that. Is that you start raising the hopes of your people, and then nothing happens with it, and then the next time you try and do something, people say, well, there's no point in, again, if you'll pardon the expression, engaging with the survey.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nothing will come.
Just to follow up on that point, absolutely, I have seen organisations falling into a kind of virtual death cycle year on year when they haven't taken up the opportunity to really push this stuff, and the whole thing's collapsed, and that's something I've always try to avoid, obviously.
It's a tragedy. I wanted just to go back to something on the data, because this whole thing is about data. You mentioned earlier you don't want to go into sort of the whole big data thing, but tell us a little bit about what is the role of data in engagement surveys. Does big data, for example, have a place? What kind of data should we be looking at? Is there any? Are there best practices for managing, analyzing that data? What kinds of things should we be thinking about?
I think that again, I hasten to move away from the phrase of big data, but
why is that, as a matter of interest, Peter? I
think that, for me, you're the expert. For me, big data is, we were talking about something with millions and millions of cases and looking at huge sets of data, and frankly, the kind of work that we tend to do, even within large organisations, isn't talking about that same size of data sets. But that's big data. But I think what we probably use is smart data. So having an intelligent stats analysis and tech team in place who can take a step back from the data and say, right, what are we trying to achieve? What outputs is this organisation trying to get from the data sets that we already have? And I think on the whole, organisations have traditionally kept terrible HR data. It's just not been seen as a priority to maintain it. And so part of our role is encouraging organisations to improve the data sets that they have, for us to be able to go in and say, if only you had a wholesome set of data here, then we'd be able to link it with this, and then we'd be able to predict who's going to leave or where your productivity levels are poor.
So this team that you're talking about, I find that very interesting. What are the kinds of people that you need to have on the analytics team then, especially from an engagement perspective anyway?
Yeah, so I guess it's people who are grounded in HR, IT, and they fall into two categories. So you need brilliant programmers who are able to create algorithms which allow us to automatically code large sets of qualitative data, but also, equally importantly, I guess the strategic IT consultants. So people who are able to, as I say, take a step back and say, not what can the data do, but what could we make the data do that would be useful to the client. So, a degree to which it's always about the client.
You've mentioned strategy a couple of times. And you suggested that some companies lack this, engagement and people strategy. Do you want to talk a little bit more about strategy and the kinds of things one should be looking for? For example, is it really important to link engagement strategy to overall business strategy and so on?
I think that for the senior leadership to understand the importance of why you'd be thinking about engagement at all, it's absolutely essential to link that. And there's reams of research out there that does that. And I think that's a kind of a good starting point, but that's almost like a hygiene factor. You're almost saying, this is important, look, right, let's move on and talk about what's important to you. And whether or not it is specifically around engagement depends on client to client.
And you and I spoke. We were chatting on email a bit earlier. I saw a provocative article that, as I mentioned, where it was suggested anyway. I'm not sure whether I entirely believe it, but I think there's probably some a grain of truth here. Is that engagement is a way of increasing employee productivity, but without giving the employee anything back. So by increasing engagement, we'll make them work harder, but without necessarily having to pay them more. Could there be a grain of truth in that sort of thinking?
Is there a grain of truth in your cynical thinking? Yes, absolutely. I mean,
not mine. I hasten to say I read that in a very credible journal, and I just thought, it is provocative but interesting.
Yeah, no, it is interesting, and the reality is that I actually agree with it.
Right.
There is an extent, but I'll spin it in a positive way. So rather than being a way for management to exploit the workers, if it's a win-win, which I believe it is, then I believe it can be justified. As I said earlier, I've worked in a team which is disengaged and it was soul-destroying, and I didn't want to go to work and I couldn't get to sleep, and it was terrible, literally because of the atmosphere and the levels of engagement with the organisation. And I've also worked in teams with a brilliant leader, with an engaged workforce. And do you know what? I did work harder and I did put in more hours and I was more productive, and I was a lot more satisfied and happy. So is it necessarily a negative?
I love the way you put that, because I think that really rings true for me, is that whether you believe in engagement or not, all of us have probably worked for a fantastic manager where we wanted to do more work for the person, where we felt satisfied, where they felt more satisfied, and we didn't necessarily want to have a huge pay increase just because we were working harder.
Absolutely. Pay is often just a hygiene factor. A couple of more macroeconomic things. If you think of levels of productivity in the UK compared to France, compared to Germany, is it a bad thing that we probably could do with being a bit more productive?
Yeah.
If you look also at the way that the retail industry is going, where we're looking at perhaps losing up to 1 million jobs in the next few years, is an individual's having better productivity or being more engaged or being more likely to try and advance themselves? Again, I'd say, is that necessarily a negative or exploitative thing? Probably not.
That's very interesting. I mean, just thinking about the role of robotics and automation, if one, as you say, in retail, where we're going to, and financial services, where we potentially are going to see a lot of employees shrinking because of robotics. Firstly, what impact is that going to have on the engagement of people if they know they may lose their work? And does that mean that the smaller workforce has got the opportunity to be more innovative? And does engagement drive innovation? So, what are your views on the whole thing of automation and engagement?
I think all of the things that you've just said are correct. Does being more engaged increase one's own innovation levels? Yeah, absolutely. I think the Engage for Success UK government project has shown that. But also I think common sense dictates it as well. It's going to be a very different workforce that's going to be that there's going to be in the future and is going to be successful in the future. And I think any organisations which employ people are going to have to ensure that people have high levels of engagement to ensure that those kind of innovations can take place.
Yeah. And tell me, as we come towards the end of what's been a very enjoyable discussion, certainly from my side, tell us about some of the more interesting projects that you've worked on.
Oh, okay. Let me think. From a tech perspective, I suppose would be the most interesting one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's the first ever online survey that I ever did back in the 90s, which was just a revelation. I was previously working in a company which had a warehouse for accepting paper ballots that used to be scanned, and then 3 days later you'd get a hard disk the size of a flat screen TV that would have, literally bits of data on it. But the joy of being able to move that from that to a programmable online early survey was just fantastic. And that's one of the reasons I've probably stayed in the business, actually, that those advancements in tech was a real turn on at the time. So that was a great leap forward. And I think probably the other one, to be perfectly honest with you, the other one is what we're doing, what we're seeing at the moment with the advancements in tech around text analysis, which is, as I say, for 20 years has been the holy grail of what I've wanted to see. And we're only just about starting to see it now. And that's allowed me, in terms of interesting projects, running a global monthly poll in a very well-known UK retail business, running it monthly with a small team, but getting great insight. That's been great.
Any other stories that come to mind?
So another example of interesting work that I always remember doing was one at a global investment bank where we got two sets of data. So we got data around retention and across different populations, across hypo populations, across different traders' desks, and we crunched it with the engagement research that we were doing. And one of the things that we found when we really looked into the data after combining those data sets with some guys from King's College, actually, was that you could relatively confidently predict who was going to leave and why in a lot of areas. And bearing in mind that for that kind of organisation at that kind of level, it costs hundreds of thousands of pounds to recruit someone and get them up to speed.
Yeah.
We were able to tweak some of the small HR practices in that division and saw, as we predicted, a subsequent lowering of unwanted leavers, which was, for me, was fascinating. We were able to put a monetary value on that as well, which, as you can imagine, as a bank, they lapped up.
Those are great stories, which really illustrate. And I think the point that I hear you making there is that there is a lot of this is common sense. You just have to approach it systematically with data, I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
And one thing that I carry away from our chat today is that if anybody says, does engagement really work, I'm going to hark back to your story about a good manager in the most terrible environment can get incredible performance out of employees. Do you have any other sort of top tips around the whole area of engagement and engagement intelligence and data that you'd like to share with listeners?
Yeah, so a few years ago, I did a meta-analysis of what engagement meant, of how it was defined by some academic organisations and by some consultancies, and the kind of top 10 reasons why people were engaged, and then crunched it all together. And it was really interesting because all of my friends in other industries assume that it's pay, and of course it's not. The thing that makes someone engaged in an organisation, from that meta-analysis that I did, was having a manager that genuinely cares about you, and a manager who is aligned with the goals of the organisation, and also for the organisation to have strong goals. So if you're kind of working for a manager who you have clear line of sight with, who genuinely cares about your well-being and genuinely cares about the well-being of the organisation, then that's the kind of number one magic golden thread that people as to why people are engaged.
So it's the old ability to give employees a sense of purpose and to communicate vision is an important driver of engagement. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. So Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever, had an absolutely brilliant, clear narrative for where the organisation was going. So it was double in 10 years and halve its carbon footprint. That was it. And everyone in that organisation knew it. And when I arrived there, I found that really interesting because normally when you work at an organisation, they probably have five visions or 10 values or whatever. No one knows what they are. But at Unilever, it was just this very clear, concise narrative, and everything that everyone did fed into that narrative. And there was a clear line of sight from every employee through their manager up to that vision, and it worked really well. It was like it was almost like a cult, that organisation. People were so happy.
Fantastic. And just as we lead into a close there, is there any final, anything else you want to say, any final message that you'd like the listeners to think about or to have?
So what I'd say is that sure, engagement is important, and sure, it's important to sell into an organisation and important for productivity of an organisation. But a lot of the research around engagement, more secondary issues, are just as important. So have in your mind, if you're going to do some research, to think about what's right for you and your organisation. You know, are you looking to retain your employees? If so, research that. Are you looking to grow your bottom line? If so, research what employees think they can do to do that, rather than just focus necessarily on the concept of engagement as the be-all and end-all of everything you do.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tucana People Analytics podcast. That was a really fascinating conversation, and I hope you took away some useful ideas. If you've enjoyed the show and found this week's session useful, then please do head over to iTunes and leave an honest rating and review. We really would appreciate it. Thanks again, and we'll catch up next week when I'll be talking with Professor David Ulrich, generally regarded as one of the foremost leaders in HR, about his leadership index and how it can contribute to the prediction of financial performance. You can follow Tucana on Twitter at Tucana_HR and via the hashtag People Analytics Podcast. Till then, I'm Max Blumberg. See you next week.